This is the story behind a 9-point buck I shot during the October lull in 2017. It was October 19th, and due to my normal weekly work schedule and having to work a 5-day hardware show down in Indianapolis, I had not yet hunted my best locations in southern Michigan, which is where I usually do most of my serious hunting. I had hunted near home several times during the early part of the season, and other than a decent 2.5-year-old 8-point passing by at 6 yards as he was moving along the edge of a standing cornfield, I hadn't seen much. If available, anywhere I hunt during the early or mid-October time frame of the season, I tend to gravitate to hunting along or within standing corn because those hunts don't in any manner affect the rut phase locations that I'm going to hunt later during pre-rut and rut back in the timber and in the bedding areas, which I try to leave alone until the pre-rut begins sometime in late October. For those of you that may not know what I mean by the October lull, on heavily pressured free permission and walk-on properties and on most public lands east of the Mississippi River, if there are any 2.5-year-old and older bucks in the area, the preseason scouting and location preparation intrusions by all the other hunters on those heavily pressured properties will have likely turned any mature bucks nocturnal outside the confines of their secure bedding areas before the season even begins. In lightly pressured areas, that is not quite the case. Many TV actors take mature bucks during the lull because there is no pressure where they hunt, and they don't kill bucks until they reach a specific age or antler criteria, which lessens the pressure on them and allows them to move much more during daylight hours. Show me bucks that have no negative consequences with hunter encounters like you see on TV and on managed properties, while those bucks are growing to maturity, and I'll show you mature bucks that move regularly during daylight hours during the entire season. In heavily pressured areas, if the preseason intrusions aren't enough to stifle mature bucks' daytime movements, the first couple days of hunting season certainly would. So the lull is sort of a dead period of the season if you are pursuing mature bucks in heavily pressured areas because the testosterone levels I have not driven up high enough for them to move, force them to move during daylight hours for sexual and breeding purposes. Standing corn, however, can change things in a very positive way as they are secure bedding as well as feeding areas. While Michigan has a ton of public lands throughout the state, one of the problems is finding properties where there is adequate security cover in the form of swamps or brushy bedding areas that butt up tightly to private ag, because public lands in Michigan don't have ag. And then keeping up on them as far as what crop is planted. When you're doing all of your prep work or re-prep work from old locations and you're done by the end of April, they haven't planted the crops yet on the bordering private parcels, so you have no idea what those crops are going to be during season. I hunt 2 pieces of public land within 40 minutes of my home, and I took a good buck from one of them last season, which was 2021, during the October lull. And I basically rattled him in, and I was within a bedding area on public land. The other public lands I hunt are at least 2.5 hours away in southern Michigan, where the bucks tend to be bigger per the same age bracket. Because I do all my scouting, new location preparation, and cleanup of old locations during postseason, and am finished by the end of April, I have no clue what the crops are going to be on the bordering private parcels that year unless I make another trip in the summer to see. And typically that's what I do. But it's kind of a pain when your places are that far away just to drive to see what the crops are. The majority of my public land rut phase hunting is done within the confines of bedding areas where I have to wear either hip boots or waders to access, especially on public land. Difficult to access areas not only alleviates the majority of my competition, but those secure areas are also the exact same places where mature whitetail bucks and even mature does have been pushed into. They basically go where hunters don't go to feel safe and secure. I will, however, hunt easy to access public land locations if they butt up to private standing cornfield, and if and only if the security cover of the public land is adequate for a mature buck to be rattled out of the private standing cornfield and into the narrow buffer between them. Typically, anytime you have public butting up to ag, there's going to be probably about a 5-yard buffer of grass or weeds between the actual break on the edge of the public bedding area to the actual edge of the standing corn. So that's a good place to hunt as long as the corn is standing. You could possibly catch a buck walking down its edge, or possibly rattle a buck out of the standing corn to you, or possibly rattled a buck out of the bedding area on the public to you as well, because there's going to be security cover on either sides once he's in or crosses through that buffer from the corn to the bedding or the bedding to the corn. I have taken several bucks in this manner, and one was by using a decoy to lure the buck out of the standing corn. It's a pain in the butt to tote decoys around, but sometimes it's best in standing corn because a buck will come in so close. He'll come in within, 15, 20 yards, and then if he can't see a visual through the few rows of corn before it hits that open buffer, he won't commit to coming any closer. He'll just stand there for a while and look and listen, and if he can't hear anything beyond that point, he'll turn around and go back into the corn or back into the bedding area. They need a visual. But I've done it many times where I've rattled small bucks out of corn or out of bedding areas that buffer corn, standing corn, without using a decoy. Bigger bucks, however, a decoy definitely helps bring them out to where you can actually get that final shot. And that's information that I have never mentioned in my books and in my DVDs or any articles or on any podcast before. There's just some things that you have to hold to yourself, because if others do the same thing in the same areas with faulty rattling sequences, improper daily timing and improper scent control, it will be ruined for me when I do it. And because Michigan public lands get just pounded to death, especially in Zone 3 in southern Michigan, I feel like if I had that information out there, a lot of people would be doing it, and I, up until this point, have not wanted that to happen. I've wanted to kind of keep that to myself, and it worked for me last year. Let's go back to the actual hunt. It was October 19th, and the lull was winding down. In the previous 2 days, I had a couple of friends tell me that they saw mature bucks chasing does. And these were reliable friends that, they know what a mature buck is. They didn't see a 6-point chasing a doe and say, hey, the rut's starting. So by them telling me that meant that there are some does coming into estrus early, at least where they were hunting or where they saw those deer. It was still too early, however, to hunt my best pre-rut spots up north. Unless we get an early cold front or a light rain, which can spur daytime activity, I typically begin hunting my rut phase locations around October 28th, sometime in the Halloween time frame. So I planned an evening hunt with 2 options once I left my minivan. During my preseason speed tours, which are designed to check my early season mast and fruit tree locations to see if they produce food, and if so, to see what type of buck sign was near them, I actually went and visited this red oak that I planned on hunting, and it was at the back of a standing cornfield, and I went during the speed tour to see if it had acorns. While it didn't have any acorns, there were 2 active scrapes under it, so it did go into my early season rotation as having buck activity. Because what I typically do is I will do a speed tour of maybe 15 or 20 early season food mast locations isolated back in the woods, and if they are dropping food, they probably have doe activity, and if they have doe activity, there's probably buck sign in the form of rubs or scrapes. And even though this one did not have any acorns in the tree, just because it had acorns in it the year prior, and bucks have memory, mature bucks have memory from the year before, there was 2 scrapes underneath it. The year before, it had, I think, 4 scrapes underneath it, and they were much more active. These were slightly worked up, not that much. On the evening of October 2nd, I went in to hunt that red oak, but the scrapes were inactive, so I actually went farther down the field and set up in a different tree, and that's where I had the 8-point pass by. Plan A on October 19th was to again go in and check that red oak scrape location that was active during pre-season during my speed tour. And if active, I was going to hunt there, and if not, I was going to go to Plan B. And Plan B required me to carry in a pair of hip boots in case Plan A was a bust. Plan A and B locations offered secure transition routes from different bedding areas to the same standing cornfield. Location A was a transition route into the cornfield from a bedding area to the east. That bedding area consisted of sparse cattails, tall marsh grasses with red brush scattered throughout it. Location B was along a transition route from a bedding area to the south of the field. This one consisted of briars, tall weeds, some scattered mature red pines, lots of deadfalls. Red pines had been falling over the last 10 years, and interspersed with autumn olive brush. With my scent control regiment, the wind direction is always irrelevant, so either location would be fine. In fact, I don't even remember what direction the wind was coming from. After changing into my scent lock clothing in the back of my minivan, I tossed on my scent lock backpack, grabbed my bow, slung the hip boots over my shoulders, and headed through the standing corn to the large red oak at the back of the cornfield. As mentioned, the red oak didn't have acorns, but there had been active scrapes there because it also was a doe transition zone into the crop field from that bedding area. It was windy enough to mask my noise of walking through the standing corn, and I went extra early because I had a Plan A and a Plan B. While slowly transitioning perpendicular through the corn rows, I looked down the rows for bedded deer. And about halfway through the field, I saw a big doe bedded about 15 yards away. I don't know what it is about the intrigue of standing corn, but it's always cool to see deer so securely and comfortably bedded in it. I watched her for a few moments before passing through the row and moving on. It's just so cool to see deer bedded in corn, chewing their cuds or whatever, having not a care in the world. As I neared the outside edge of the corn near the oak, it began to get a little sparse as the raccoons had knocked it down and the deer were eating on it. Because that was a transition zone, the deer, as soon as they come out of the swamp, they were eating corn right there at that location. Any place there is a transition route of deer traffic into a standing cornfield, the area of corn on the edge is always relatively trashed out compared to the rest of the field. Once at the oak, the scrapes were still inactive, so it was time for Plan B. I went back into the standing corn about 10 rows and then headed south down that row until I hit the corner of the field. So now I was actually going parallel with the rows. I was walking down a row until I hit the other corner of the field. I then left the corn and walked through a narrow 40-yard swampy area that bordered a river. I swapped into my hip boots, crossed the 30-yard wide river, swapped back into my muck boots, rolled up the hip boots and stuffed them into a plastic bag and placed them under an uprooted tree stump. Then I walked over to my location at the base of a hard-leaning maple tree about 15 yards from the riverbank. So my location was very close to this crossing spot. This was an ESS 2-panel location for 2 reasons. There was no way in hell you could have put a conventional stand in this severely leaning crooked tree, which was likely about a 15, if not more, degree lean. Secondly, the versatility of being able to overlap the ESS 2-panel into a 6-inch deep so that it would just cover the bottom of my butt made it a lot more comfortable than a single panel, which would put too much stress on my lower back due to the top of the saddle on a single panel riding up so high. When saddle hunting in a severely leaning tree where your body is in a more upright position in comparison to the tree's trunk, the strap along the top of a single panel saddle becomes a stress point, whereas with a 2-panel saddle, you can narrow the panels, overlap the panels, so where the top of the saddle in the short seat that you've got, the narrow seat that you have, doesn't ride much up above the top of your butt crack. To put it bluntly, it's not up into your waist area and into your lower back like a single panel saddle is. So it's much more comfortable when you're sitting in certain types of positions with a 2-panel. In the short 15-yard walk to the Maple, I was shocked to see 3 small but active scrapes on the runway heading east along the riverbank. I prepared this new location in March because over the years, the adjoining bedding area to the south, it had been getting denser and was therefore attracting and holding more deer. Previously, those red pines were all grown and standing, and they are way beyond their maturity level, and they were starting to tip over 4 or 5 years prior, and it was just really densing up in this bedding area. This was a stand of red pines that had been planted in the late 40s. So they're mature, and they just started tipping over, letting sunlight in, made it much more conducive for briars and weeds and autumn olive to grow in there, making it become an awesome bedding area. Along with the riverbank runway going east, there is a better used runway 12 yards east of the actual hunting tree, the Maple, and it runs directly south into the bedding area. When I walked that runway in the spring, there were several secondary runways within the bedding area that fed into that runway going north to the river. This was the main runway coming out of the bedding area, and it crossed the shallow area of the river and continued into the crop field. This is a location that I only hunt when the crop field is in standing corn, so the deer can't transition from security cover of the bedding area to the security cover of the standing corn, which is also a feeding area. Standing corn is awesome because it's not only heavy security cover, 10 to 12 feet tall, it's also a natural feeding zone. The Maple was perfect for several reasons. I can access it through the field for an evening hunt without spooking deer, and as long as the field is in standing corn, I can also exit through it without spooking deer. You'd never go on an evening hunt through the bedding area to hunt a location where you expect the deer to cross from the bedding area into something else, because basically you're spooking the deer that you're trying to hunt with your entry through the bedding area to the tree. Entry and exit routes are very critical to success, especially in pressured areas where deer do not tolerate much human activity. Secondly, the wide, shallow area of the river where I cross with hip boots is also where deer cross. That's why this runway coming out of this major bedding area runs right up to the river and crosses right where I crossed. It's just a shallow area of the river, because it's much deeper in either direction you go, to the right or to the left, because there's river bends and the water's just deeper. I term this as a river funnel, just like you'd find a pinch point in timber between a big timber A and a big timber B, and there's a narrow area of transition cover where it's, deer have security cover from point A to point B. Well, this here is it's a river funnel. It's for different reasons, though. It's so the deer don't have to swim across the river. They can walk across the river. It's just the path of least resistance. It's just like if you're salmon fishing or steelhead fishing or trout fishing in a river, after you've fished it a few times, you learn the areas where you can cross the easiest, where the river is actually the shallowest. So deer are no different than we are. They always like the path of least resistance, as long as there's adequate security cover to do it during daylight hours. It was a beautiful evening for being on a lake somewhere, getting a tan or going fishing, as the temperature was 71 degrees and there was not a cloud in the sky. I went in very early because I had a 2-part plan, and I know it takes time to walk through a standing cornfield because I have to do it so slow. And then if plan A didn't work, I had to go to a plan B. So I went in really early. So I was up the tree probably at least a half an hour to an hour earlier than I had planned. I decided to take a nap for about a half an hour. At 4:40, I heard something moving to the south, and within moments, a big doe came into view, and she was running by me on that north-south runway, and she ran across the river. She didn't even slow down, and she ran through that tall marsh grasses on the other side of the river and directly into the standing corn, and she never stopped for a minute. She had no fawns with her, and I've been hunting long enough to know that mature does without fawns are much too cautious to randomly just run through areas with reckless abandon unless they're either being chased by a buck or a coyote or they were spooked by a human. While I never expect much action this early in the season or that early in the evening from a mature buck in a pressured area, sure enough, And I knew there was a buck behind her because she had her tongue kind of out and was panting a little bit when she ran by. Sure enough, here comes a buck. Other than noticing he had a decent rack, he didn't give me any time to scrutinize it. He approached rapidly down the same runway as the doe and came to an abrupt stop at the scrape closest to the river because it was right at that spot where the runway going east along the river and the runway coming in from the south converged. I had already taken my Matthews Halon X bow off its hanger, and when he stopped to scent check the scrape, he was slightly quartering away. I came to full draw and released my G5 striker that was attached to a Maxima Red. I believe it was a 250 arrow. And I believe I was shooting 45 pounds at the time. The hit was perfectly placed about 6 inches behind the shoulder, which would angle the arrow right through the boiler room in both lungs. He turned and ran back along the same runway and then broke east and went into the denser bedding area of brush, tall weeds, briars, and deadfalls. I ever so slowly and quietly climbed down. I went back to my minivan, took off my scent lock clothing, and changed into some lighter stuff and called a couple of non-hunting friends to help me get him out. One of them didn't own any waders, so he waded along the cornfield with my VersaCart until we recovered him and brought him across the river. It's kind of cool dragging a deer across the river because they have hollow hairs and they float. Although he traveled quite a distance before expiring, it only took about 10 minutes to find the 9-point. My 2-year-old grandson could have likely found him because the blood trail was very heavy. He was a big-bodied buck and was at least 3.5 years old, and in that area, not many bucks survived to reach that age bracket. He was a little light on the antler side, which is also normal for northern Michigan sandy soil areas. But he still had a good set of antlers. It was a great hunt, especially for that warm a weather and also for being during the October lull. This was a spot I had no plans on hunting later that year during the rut phases, so to kill something like that during the October lull is a pretty big deal. To the best of my memory, I hadn't taken a good buck during the lull in quite a few years, and I can thank the standing corn and the hip boots for this kill, as without either, it would not have happened in that area.